The whole day through, just an old sweet song. For many old school fans, wrestling in the South means one promotion and one promotion above all others. And seeing that it's a major component of what would be WCW, I say a lot of fans even today owe a lot to this once great company. But how did it rise? How did it fall? Well, I've got Georgia on my mind, and that's exactly what we're going to talk about here today, because this is the history of Georgia Championship Wrestling. Thank you so much for the amazing support over on Patreon, Ron Hawthorne. To get your own Patreon shoutout, sign up over on my Patreon page. Before we continue with the video, allow me to ask that you please make sure that you're a member of the Know-It-All Nation and that you're subscribed to this very channel. Now that we've said that, let's get back into the episode. Created in Atlanta just several years before the National Wrestling Alliance, Georgia Championship Wrestling was originally known as ABC Booking. It was founded by Paul Jones, a retired wrestler who was born Andrew Lutzy, not to be confused with Paul Frederick, a much younger wrestler who also went by the same name. Despite being created before the Alliance, ABC Booking still regularly hosted the NWA champion, all the while making sure to maintain their own sense of identity as well as promoting their own championships, with the Georgia Heavyweight title being particularly noteworthy. The exact start date of the title is unknown, with some claiming that it was created in the 1950s, but there are other reports stating that it goes as far back as the 1930s. What we do know for sure is that the belt first started gaining prominence in February of 1963, with such stars holding the belt in the beginning as Choo Choo Lin, Don Fargo, and most of all, El Mongol, who would win the title an impressive 10 times. The championship is still around even to this day, thanks especially to the revival of GCW, and no, I'm not talking about Game Changer Wrestling, but you'll have to wait to the end of the video to find out more about that. Now, this wasn't the only belt to matter in Georgia at the time, as their tag division was quite hot too. The tag titles were primarily highlighted starting in the 1960s, with the Vachons being the first major stars to hold them, although they would have to make way for the Assassins, Jody Hamilton and Tom Renesto, who would get to hold the tag titles 10 times themselves. Paul Jones would run the company for 30 years before stepping away from operations. However, he still retained some ownership of the promotion. Although, starting in the early 70s, Ray Gunko, Paul's assistant, was already helping out so much so that things pretty much ran under him from that point on. But the 1970s was a turning point for the promotion for other reasons as well, because on Christmas Day 1971, the company would make its television debut. This Christmas special was followed by a regular ongoing television series hosted by Ed Capral, which was called Big Time Wrestling. Not to be confused with all the other promotions calling themselves by the same name. Man, a lot of confusion in this episode already. The show began running on WQXI-TV in Atlanta, Georgia, but it was also taped and sent to Savannah and Augusta as well. Now originally, during the start of the promotion, matches would take place in Atlanta's Municipal Auditorium on Fridays, but in 1972, the company would go through a bit of an overhaul, switching venues to the brand new Omni Coliseum, and then switching television stations to a little independent UHF station called WTCG. You might know it better for its owner at the time, Ted Turner, and by its current name, TBS. Unfortunately, Ray's time in charge would not last very long. His wife figured she would get control of the company and was surprised that it didn't happen. The promotion was instead sold out from under her to Bill Watts and was renamed Mid-South Sports, which is different from Mid-South Wrestling, and yes, I already did a video about that as well. Anyway, feeling like she was wronged, Ann Gunko created her own promotion called the All-South Wrestling Alliance, an outlaw promotion that competed against Mid-South Sports and operated outside of the NWA. During this time, a lot of talent would join Ann's company, such as then tag team champions Dick Steinborn and Argentina Apollo, who would leave and just abandon their championships. And to add to this, All-South would get Mid-South's TV time slot. Although they would still remain on the same channel, they were just moved to a different time. Now naturally, this was seen as something of a problem for Bill Watts, who clearly underestimated his competition, and so he decided to turn to an expert, Jim Barnett, a man who had promoted all over from Michigan to Ohio to even Australia, and his promotion down under just happened to be named World Championship Wrestling. Not the one you're thinking of, at least not yet. Now, after a decade, he would sell his Australian promotion and return home to the United States, where he would become one of the owners of Georgia Championship Wrestling. And thanks to Jim, Ann's All-South promotion took an immediate nosedive, getting locked out of arena dates and having talent jump back to her competition. And as a result, and after only 2 short years, the All-South Wrestling Alliance would close its doors, with Mid-South Sports officially winning the war. In 1976, WTCG would become distributed via satellite, and Mid-South Sports was renamed to Georgia Championship Wrestling. The show was hosted by the legendary Gordon Soley and was filmed in Atlanta out of a small studio on Peachtree Street. Their flagship show would air on Saturday nights with a supplementary show on Sundays, and it was also a major part of what kept this new superstation afloat during its initial run. Georgia Championship Wrestling became must-see TV for fans in the area, but it also became widely important for wrestlers all across the country, as talent from everywhere started to hear that Georgia was the place to be if you wanted to get paid and you wanted to get over. Now, there are too many stars to name, but such major acts for the promotion included 12-time Georgia Heavyweight Champion Mr. Wrestling 2, the Masked Superstar, the Minnesota Wrecking Crew, the Freebirds, and of course, the Briscoe Brothers. And again, no, not the ones you're thinking of. I'm talking about Jerry and Jack Briscoe, but we'll be getting more into them in just a little bit. Now, as good as all this was for the promotion, it was beginning to cause something of a problem for certain people. Seeing that GCW was aired via satellite, it does mean that technically speaking, it was the first NWA show to air on a national level. Now, I know we take it for granted today, but once upon a time, the idea of a wrestling program being available to watch all across the entire country was quite a big deal. And it was also seen as something of a potential issue for those in the NWA. Considering that GCW was merely one part of the National Wrestling Alliance, it raised some concerns that perhaps the company was growing too big for its britches, with the belief that an NWA affiliate could not and should not go national, although there is a difference between airing nationally and being a national promotion. Whatever the case, the debate still rages on, and we're no closer to getting an answer as to what the real plans really are now than we were back then. Either way, all we know for sure is that this is just about as far as the company was ever going to go. In 1982, the show Georgia Championship Wrestling was renamed yet again, this time to World Championship Wrestling. I guess Barnett really liked the name. And they were beginning to expand into Jim's old stomping grounds of Ohio and Michigan. However, the following year in 1983, Barnett would end up getting backdoored into having to sell most of his shares to a conglomerate of wrestlers, which included Jerry and Jack Briscoe as well as Ole Anderson. This would ultimately lead to the promotion's downfall. Enter Vince McMahon. As previously covered numerous times on this channel, Vince McMahon had begun expanding his promotion, the WWF, and was seeking to solidify that by gaining as much national airtime as possible. He already had shows on the USA Network, but he felt that wasn't enough. Vince wanted a second national cable show in order to guarantee his success. However, rather than starting from scratch, McMahon figured it'd be easier to just buy a show that already was being aired all across the country. The only hiccup was that there was only one option, GCW on WTBS, and their fan base of hardcore athletic Georgia-style wrestling was very different from what the WWF was offering. But even though the bonds between the fans and the product were very strong, it was the bonds backstage that were not. Even though the Briscoes were the major stakeholders in the company, Ole served as head booker and worked his way into becoming the de facto head of operations. Meanwhile, Vince had tried repeatedly to get TBS owner Ted Turner to sell him GCW's Saturday night time slot, but Turner wouldn't budge, and so, not knowing how to quit, Vince McMahon figured that if Turner wouldn't sell GCW's time slot, maybe he should just go through GCW itself. Despite not owning the biggest portion of the company, Ole Anderson was the man in charge, even being trusted for a period of time to book for both GCW and Jim Crockett Promotions, sometimes even simultaneously. Eventually, Ole would leave JCP in order to focus 100% of his attention on Georgia Championship Wrestling, although he couldn't have picked a worse time. As all this was going on, the majority shareholders, the Briscoe brothers, along with Jim Barnett, who was still there with his remaining shares, were growing increasingly dissatisfied with Ole Anderson and his total control. Smelling blood in the water due to the dissension in the ranks, Vince McMahon swooped on in and made an offer to Jim Barnett in order to buy his shares. What Barnett didn't realize is that McMahon had also made the same deal with Jerry and Jack Briscoe. This would result in Paul Jones, who still had some stake in the company, having to follow suit, seeing the writing on the wall. And thus, Vince McMahon would become the majority shareholder of Georgia Championship Wrestling. Following this, many GCW personnel were either released or resigned, including Gordon Solie, and many fans were stunned to see Vince McMahon on their television screens telling them that their beloved GCW was now being replaced by WWF on an episode which has now become known as Black Saturday. Now, at first, McMahon promised original programming for the TBS show. That didn't happen right away, as they first began airing clips from the USA show as well as featuring content from the likes of Madison Square Garden. Nothing from Georgia. Then, nearly a year later, in March of 1985, WWF would begin finally making use of the TBS studios, and they would change the name of the show to WWF Georgia Championship Wrestling. Although, while it did make use of the facility and it did host some original matches, the show was mostly a means to promote WrestleMania. Now, not surprisingly, this would cause the ratings to plummet, with armies of fans irate with the change, leaving Ted Turner to have to right the ship. Uncle Ted went to Bill Watts, who was now running a promotion called Mid-South Wrestling, and he would offer him a time slot on Sunday. He would offer yet another time slot on Saturday mornings to Ole Anderson, who went from running Georgia Championship Wrestling to running Championship Wrestling from Georgia. See, it's different. It's not the same. Anyway, McMahon was furious about this, especially with both of these new shows doing better in the ratings. So now, Vince had to react, and he did so by going to Jim Barnett, who, along with the Briscoes, were given jobs with the WWF. Barnett would become the go-between for Vince and Jim Crockett Jr., who at the time were rivals, as Crockett was trying to counteract everything that WWF was doing. Nevertheless, a deal was made, and Crockett would pay $1 million to buy Vince McMahon's World Championship Wrestling, which he in turn would sell to Ted Turner, and Turner would take all of it and create his very own promotion called WCW, which in 2001 would be sold right back to Vince McMahon. Barnett would go on to become VP of Titan Sports before working for Jim Crockett Promotions in 1987, staying there through the transition to WCW as a senior advisor. He would later return to WWE following the sale in 2001. As for Jack Briscoe, he would join the WWF after the deal with Vince McMahon, but he would step away from the business entirely in 1985, disenfranchised with the direction of pro wrestling. His brother Jerry would stay with McMahon, even being featured as a stooge during the Attitude Era. He would be furloughed and released in 2020. And as for Ole Anderson, he would swear revenge against all parties. And not surprisingly, Ole was not included amongst the rest of the Horsemen during their induction into the WWE Hall of Fame in 2012. As for today, the rights to promote under the Georgia Championship Wrestling banner have been acquired numerous times, starting in the 1990s with Grady Odom, running reunion shows throughout the likes of Augusta, Athens, and Macon, Georgia. Tim Rice and Chris Nellens would gain the rights to promote under GCW in 2020. Other arms reach out to me, other eyes smile tenderly, still in peaceful dreams I see, the road leads back to you. I said just an old sweet song keeps Georgia on my mind. Well, there you go, the history of Georgia Championship Wrestling. If you enjoyed this video, please hit like and make sure that you're subscribed. I want to give a big thank you to all my awesome Patreon supporters out there, and I want to thank you for watching. And as always, Dave knows.